Zenless Zone Zero has one of the most interesting narrative foundations I've seen in a gacha game in a long time. A post-apocalyptic city built on the ruins of the old world, a reality-breaking disaster called Hollows, a society that didn't survive by defeating the apocalypse, but by learning how to live inside it. And at the center of all of this is one idea that immediately stood out when the game first launched. Proxies. Not heroes, not chosen ones, not frontline fighters saving the world. Proxies were intermediaries, navigators, fixers operating in the gray space between disaster and normal life. But lately, I've been feeling like something important has been quietly slipping away from that concept. Not in a loud way, not through some single bad update or obvious narrative mistake. More like erosion, where an idea slowly loses its weight the more it gets reused, simplified, and pushed towards convenience. So today, I want to talk about the role of proxies in Zenless Zone Zero, why they were such a strong narrative idea at the start, how that meaning has diluted over time, and why this isn't really about one controversial decision, but about balance. And just to be clear, before we go any further, this is not a video about why the protagonist going into Hollows is inherently bad. That can work. There are ways to write that well. This is about what got lost along the way, and why being a proxy used to mean more than just having access to a dangerous space. To understand why that loss mattered, we first need to rewind a bit, back to what being a proxy actually represented when Zenless Zone Zero began. When Zenless Zone Zero started, being a proxy meant more than just having an ability. Yes, proxies could navigate hollows, that was the mechanical part. But narratively, being a proxy was an identity. You weren't a frontline fighter, you weren't a hero charging into danger, you weren't even physically present most of the time. You were a mediator, a connector, someone who understands the chaos well enough to guide others through it. And the distinction mattered more than it might seem at first, because being a proxy wasn't about strength, it was about position. You existed in a strange social space, too close to the hollows to be considered normal, too removed from direct combat to be considered a soldier. People didn't see you as a savior, they saw you as a necessary risk. That shaped everything. It shaped how the world treated you. It shaped the kind of jobs you took. It shaped how danger entered the story. Your power wasn't physical, it was informational, social, strategic. You knew how hollows behaved. You knew which routes were survivable. You knew who to contact, who to avoid, and how to move through a system built on instability. And because of that, the tension around proxies didn't come from combat alone. It came from trust, from secrecy, from the fact that every job carried consequences beyond just winning or losing a fight. A proxy wasn't just someone who entered dangerous spaces, they were someone who managed risk on behalf of everyone else. And crucially, this role didn't exist in isolation. It was supported by an entire system, one that reinforced the idea that proxies weren't supposed to be heroes at the center of the action. To really understand that system and why its erosion matters so much, we need to talk about the pieces that made the proxy's role work in the first place. Because proxies were never meant to operate alone. This is where Fairy and Eous come in. They weren't just cute mascots, they weren't just gameplay helpers, and they definitely weren't just UI conveniences. They represented distance. They symbolized the idea that the protagonist didn't need to be physically inside a hollow to matter. That influence didn't require presence. That control didn't require dominance. For them, the story could explore something rare in gacha narrative: indirect agency, risk without direct presence, influence without brute force. The protagonists mattered because they understood the world, not because they punched the hardest thing in the room. And that distinction did real narrative work. It meant danger could exist without turning every conflict into a boss fight. It meant tension could come from bad information, bad timing, or bad judgment, not just overwhelming force. It also meant that the protagonist's role was fundamentally different from everyone else's. They weren't competing with agents for spotlight, they weren't trying to outshine fighters or outscale threats. They were the one holding the system together, and that's a rare position for a gacha protagonist. A really interesting one. But here's the problem. The entire dynamic only works as long as distance matters. As long as meditation is more valuable than presence. As long as being outside the hollow is part of the role, not the limitation to be overcome. And once that balance starts to shift, everything built on top of it starts to change too. Because the moment the protagonist steps fully into the hollow themselves, Fairy and Eous stopped being symbols and started being accessories. Over time, that changed. The protagonists started entering hollows themselves more often. They become more directly involved, more present, more traditionally protagonist-like. And on its own, that's not a problem. That angle can absolutely be explored narratively. You can write a compelling story where proxies step closer to danger. You can let them be more active participants. In theory, this could have been an evolution, but the issue isn't the story added presence. It's that presence quietly replaced mediation. Instead of integrating this new angle with the old one, instead of asking, how does a proxy change when they're forced to be physically present? The story simply stopped treating distance as important, and that's a subtle shift, but a destructive one. Because when presence becomes the default, mediation stops being special. When the protagonist can just enter the hollow like everyone else's, their role stops being about coordination, foresight, or judgment, and starts drifting toward standard hero logic. And again, that's not automatically bad, but Zenless Zone Zero didn't build its identity around a standard hero. It built it around systems, distance, roles that exist because the world was too dangerous to face directly. So when that shift happened, it didn't just change how the protagonist acted, it changed what being a proxy meant. And more importantly, it changed what the story stopped doing as a result. When the protagonists become more traditional heroic, Fairy and Eous lost narrative weight. Their symbolic role diminished, their necessity faded. And as that happened, being a proxy slowly stopped meaning something specific. It stopped meaning navigating society from the margins, operating in secrecy, dealing with suspicion, leverage, and consequence, and it started meaning something much simpler. Yeah, we can go into hollows too. And that simplification matters. Because once the proxy identity flattened, the kinds of stories the game could tell flattened with it. We stopped getting tension rooted in trust, in misinformation, in jobs that went wrong not because someone was too weak, but because someone made the wrong call. The danger used to come from coordinated failures, from social risk, from operating in a world where being known as a proxy could help you or ruin you. When everyone knows who you are and no one really reacts to it, that friction disappears, and without friction, identity loses weight. The proxy stops being a lens through which the world is experienced and becomes a label that doesn't actually change how the story unfolds. That's what I mean when I say the identity flattened. And once that happens, the problem isn't just thematic anymore. It starts affecting the kinds of narratives the game can tell, and why over time the story can begin to feel more straightforward than it needs to be. This actually ties into a much bigger storytelling issue, the problem of extremes. On one end of the spectrum, you have faceless, passive, self-insert protagonists. They don't drive the story, they don't meaningfully change the world, they exist mostly as a camera the player looks through. That's bad. On the other end of the spectrum, you have hyper-centralized action protagonists, characters who dominate every scene, solve every problem, and absorb all narrative importance. And that's also bad, because when the protagonist becomes too central, the world starts shrinking around them. Other characters lose agency, systems stop mattering, society becomes background noise instead of a living structure. The story turns inward. Everything exists to orbit the protagonist. But here's the thing, there isn't just a choice between those two extremes. There's an entire spectrum in between. And Zenless Zone Zero started in a really interesting middle ground. The protagonists matter, but they weren't the solution to every problem. They influenced the world indirectly. They navigated systems instead of overpowering them. They were important because the world was bigger than them. That balance is rare, and it's fragile. So when the story drifted towards a more traditionally heroic framing, when presence replaced mediation, it didn't just change how the protagonist acted, it shifted where they sat on that spectrum. And once you start sliding towards one extreme, the question isn't, is this wrong? The question becomes, what kind of story are you no longer able to tell? This is the part that bothers me the most, because right now it feels like being a proxy barely registers anymore. Everyone knows the protagonists are proxies, no one really reacts to it, no one questions it, no one fears it, no one tries to exploit it. And that's a problem, because identity only matters if the world responds to it. In the early framing, being a proxy should have complicated every interaction. Some people should have been wary. Some people should have been opportunistic. Some should have seen proxies as necessary evils, others as liabilities, others as tools. Instead, the role feels normalized, sanitized, frictionless. And when that happens, the proxy identity stops functioning as a narrative pressure point. It no longer creates tension. It no longer reshapes conversations. It no longer alters the power dynamics in a room. It becomes background information. And that's a huge loss, because proxies are supposed to exist in a morally unstable space. They deal with dangerous knowledge. They profit from catastrophe. They enable systems that keep new Eridu alive, but also put it at constant risk. They should make people uncomfortable. When the world stops reacting to that discomfort, the story loses one of its sharpest tools. And to be clear, this doesn't mean the story is broken. It means the story has simplified something that was once doing a lot of heavy lifting. And that brings us to the real question. What kind of story does Zenless Zone Zero want to tell going forward? And does the current version of the proxy still serve the story? And this is where everything we've talked about starts to converge. And I want to be careful with this word, but this is why the story can sometimes feel more basic now. Not because it's simple, not because it's badly written, not because the ideas themselves are weak, but because it's lost friction. When roles lose consequence, stories lose texture, and when identity stops actively shaping the narrative, everything starts to blur together. Conflicts resolves more cleanly, interactions feel safer, the world feels less reactive, not because the stakes are lower, but because fewer things are pressing back against the characters. The proxy doesn't complicate the room anymore. It doesn't introduce risk into conversation. It doesn't create social danger or ethical tension. So the story starts relying more on familiar structures, combat escalation, clear antagonists, straightforward resolutions. And those aren't bad tools, but they're tools you reach for when the world itself stops doing narrative work. When the setting, the roles, and the identities all push back less, the story has to move forward in more predictable ways. That's what I mean when I say it feels more basic, not emptier, not worse, just smoother. And smooth stories are easier to follow, but they're also easier to forget. The frustrating part is that this didn't happen because the original idea was flawed. It happened because the balance shifted. And balance in storytelling, it's something you can still reclaim. I want to be very clear about something before we end this. This isn't about going back. I don't want Zenless Zone Zero to rewind. I don't want to erase the protagonist's growth. And I definitely don't want them locked out of Hallows forever. Change isn't the problem. The problem is replacement instead of integration. You can absolutely have active protagonist and a meaningful proxy identity. You can let the protagonist step into danger without turning mediation into an afterthought. You can let Fairy and Eous matter again, not as gimmicks, but as expression of how proxies interact with the world. And most importantly, you can let society react again. Because roles only matter if they change how the world treats you. Zenless Zone Zero still has an incredible foundation. Its world building is strong, its themes are sharp, its setting is doing a lot of heavy narrative lifting. But roles matter, identity matters, and proxy used to mean something heavier than an ability tooltip. It used to be a position in society, a source of tension, a reason the world felt dangerous even outside of combat. If the writers can find that balance again between presence and mediation, between action and consequence, then Zenless Zone Zero can regain the edge that made it stand out in the first place. Not by undoing progress, but by remembering what made the concept powerful to begin with. But let me know what you think. Do you miss the old proxy dynamic? Or do you prefer the protagonists being more directly involved? Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.